I am going to talk to us about communicating with data. And there's a lot that we can talk about here and we can go into. But before we get started, I would like this to be an interactive session. So I'm going to put up I'll put this in the chat as well. If you're on your phone, you can take a picture of that QR code. If you are not, you can just go to, I should have had this ready to go. Sorry, typing and speaking at the same time is going to be a little bit rough. But to poll everywhere, Deidre Downing 192, and that's now in the chat for you to copy and paste. And as you're getting there, I would love if you could just answer this question for me. What's your role? And we've got people from all over the world, but I imagine at a data science meetup, there are tons of possible roles that you have. So just curious what those are. And if it's other, let us know in the chat. It's so suspenseful watching the bars move back and forth. So I know this is everyone's first time in, so we'll leave this up for a minute. We'll use this poll everywhere. So if you're in on your phone, don't let it go too far away. We'll continue to use this link. Javier, physician, welcome. Another tricky discipline where communicating technical things to generally non-technical audiences as patients. All right, we've got an HR and data operations manager in that other category as well. And we'll give everyone about 20 more seconds to answer.
I actually call advanced, physicians are advanced data scientists. So they see a lot of people and they get experience and they make different decisions with time.
Good researcher, student of data science. So like we're across the board, a lot of different roles here. And I love that because data permeates almost everything we do in our professional lives, whether or not we have a specific data title in our job or not. And one of the things that we're going to talk about today is our job in translating what we know as subject matter experts, in this case data, to people who might not be as fluent as we are. So I'm going to start us off here asking a question other than what you do. And in this instance, I'm curious what that chart is telling you. I'm just kidding. You don't need to try to make sense of that. There's so much going on. There's so many data labels that you have to work pretty hard. And I didn't even give you any background, right? This is actually 20 years, a little over 20 years worth of data from the global music industry about where our patterns of consumption have changed in terms of where we're spending money on music. Even with that background, you still have to work to make sense of the data. And so when I talk about communicating with data, getting straight to the point, making sure we focus on the insights that matter, what I'm really wanting us to focus on is how are we making it easier for our audience? We'll call audience whoever is interacting with our work, whether it's a presentation or visually or through a dashboard. How do we make it easier for them? And so we can reduce the number of data points. We can add in some markers about key events, right? We all know we stopped buying CDs at a certain point, but you might have forgotten when the iPod hit the market, which is crazy. 2001 feels like way too early of a date for that. Right? You might have remembered about when you joined Spotify, but having these things mapped out helps put some context around the information you want to share and the trends that you want to highlight for your stakeholders. Now, I think many of us might have this view that understanding data shouldn't be difficult. And I want us to get that out of our heads right, because some people are very data minded. Right? They can look at data, they can look at trends, and it just makes sense to them, right? Whether it's on the programming side or just looking at reports. For a lot of people, that's not the case. And I want to change this statement around here to say, actually, understanding our key takeaways and actionable insights from data shouldn't be difficult. Because those things, our key takeaways and our actionable insights, are where we derive value from our data, and being able to communicate that is an incredibly important skill. And so I'll use the phrase data storytelling a bit as we are going through our talk today. And what I really want to make sure we walk away with when we're talking about the term data storytelling, which is much more popular than it used to be, but I feel like some people have different definitions than the other. What I want to really focus on is data storytelling, to me, helps us elevate the message to make our insights accessible and actionable. So accessible meaning everyone can have a conversation about it, that you've invited into the conversation, right? We're not leaving anyone out in the cold. How do we do that? Well, I'm going to throw up 4 examples of some data visualizations that might look familiar. You might see similar things in your work, and just talk about them in the end. So we have the churn rate for some US telcos. Lovely combo chart showing us the impact of different sales strategies on different products. Pharmaceutical R&D spending over a course of about 15 years. And finally, a dashboard, like a health snapshot for a call center. Now, each of these on their own probably make complete sense to the person that created them or uses them regularly. But to the rest of us, we have to work to make sense of it, either because we don't have the context or the background, but also because these visualizations don't answer the question, so what? My time is valuable, your time is valuable, your colleagues' time is valuable. We want to get straight to the point and not have people wonder why we've been asked into either a meeting or a conversation or a presentation. And that's what we're going to focus on today. So to get us primed here, I'm curious, I have a feeling I know a little bit about this audience, but I like to just make sure. Let's say you needed to take a look at a health metrics dashboard like this one. Which of those people most represents your reaction? And if you go back into that poll everywhere, you'll be able to just point on the person that best represents your sort of initial reaction when you have to deal with data. So we're getting some votes for that middle gentleman there, maybe looking a little contemplating, right? It seems to be the most popular one. One of you just doesn't have time for this, like our bottom left corner there. A couple of you are like me. You are top right, super excited. So we're not normal. Those of us who get super excited about working with data, looking at data without any context, we are by far in the minority. And we should know this about ourselves. And what we need to really think about is the people that we're sharing information with could be any of these people up here, right? Everyone comes in with a different fluency level, a different understanding of, and a different confidence level in working with and making decisions with data. And we need to recognize that at the start before we start trying to communicate. Now, data is a language that needs to be translated. And I really want to focus on this idea of a language here, right? We can be fluent in different ways. So you might be a novice at coding. That's me. I can play around with Python a little bit, but I'd like to think I'm fluent in using data to make decisions. Right? The need for my role varies, and not everyone needs to be fluent in every part of data as a language, right? Think about it just like a regular language that you speak. I was recently in France on vacation, and my high school French can definitely help me order off the menu and find key places like the restroom or the museum entrance, right? But if I were to go live there, I would need far more than that. I would need to move past that novice level into conversational and fluent. We need to be sure we're talking to people at the right fluency level. They might not be where we are, but we need to make sure we're getting to the point and communicating along that spectrum. Okay. So now that we sort of covered that data's a language, let's talk about stories. So I used the phrase data storytelling earlier, and sometimes I think stories get blown out. We get all in our heads about needing to create sort of this great anecdote or build up to the plot or have this really funny story that we need to tell people. That's not what I mean by stories. Okay. Let me give you an example. I'm going to play a clip for you. It's about a minute long. There's no sound, so you're not missing anything. And what I'd like for you to do when it's over is in the chat, tell me what happened. All right, let's go a minute, no sound. Here we go. That's silly. Okay, well, this is fun. It doesn't want to work. Give me 1 second. I will pull up the file so that you can see it, because it is actually completely worth looking at here. Here we go. Okay, 1 minute. Tell me what happens. Okay. What happened? Go ahead and put it in the chat. What occurred in our video there? So Rebecca's kicked us off here, saying we've got an aggressive triangle and a circle that wished to fight, another triangle that didn't want to leave. Nicola said a fight, possibly. We've got a comment here that there's a chase, or that the circle kept running away from the triangles. Javier saying someone went mad in the end. Right? Howard saying the Ball's house got invaded. There's a lot to unpack here. That was just a minute of 2 triangles and 1 circle moving laterally and vertically across a 2-dimensional plane. That's it. But because I asked you, or partially because I asked you to tell me what was going on afterwards, you knew you needed to remember. And when we need to make a memory, we latch on to something that seems familiar. So we see a lot of fighting and chases in your responses. Something perhaps is popping into your head related to that, maybe like a Tom and Jerry cartoon. I get a lot of parents saying, "Those look like my kids fighting." But you created this connection with these shapes because you needed to remember. And a huge part of communicating effectively, particularly when we're talking about anything technical, is that we help people form a memory that may not be something that they would do otherwise, right? We need to help them connect what we're sharing to an experience or an idea or concept that they've heard before. So this video is from a famous experiment by a couple of psychologists who were curious how we start forming memories. And for the most part, about 95% of the students answered the way you all did. We gave some sort of human characteristics or story, and only about 5% of the people said, no, they're just shapes moving along a screen. So the majority of us do that, right? They create a memory around a story. That's why we're going to talk a bit about stories today. All right, so we've got to what happened. Now, what we need to do when we're talking about data is move from information into the realm of insight. We need to take all the data that we have access to, which is oftentimes way more than we need, and try to make sense of it and organize it and figure out what's important. So we're going to do that, but with a fairly straightforward example on office costs. Now, you may have looked at that and just very quickly seen, oh, all of those office costs for each city, New York, Boston, and Austin, are increasing. But you still needed to exert a bit of energy to do that. Even though it's just 3 series in a line chart, there's still some thinking and some interpretation that you have to do using up that limited cognitive energy that you have. So this is our information. We can make it easier for someone consuming it by telling them what they're looking at. Office costs have steadily increased across all existing sites. Sure, we saw that, but wouldn't it be easier to read it and then confirm with the data that that statement makes sense? But we're still missing the so what. Okay, office prices have risen. Well, they've gotten so high in New York that we're over budget and we need to close that office immediately. Perhaps a bold statement, but you've told me why I'm looking at this, which is we need to have a conversation about New York. Got straight to the point. And that's what, again, data storytelling is going to help us do. When we just have information, there's a story awaiting discovery. There's so much that we could possibly share. And we, as the communicators, need to make sense of it and prioritize for our audience. And so that's where we move into the realm of data storytelling, when we go past the exploration of data and into explaining or persuading, depending on what's needed. This has all been kind of theoretical so far. So I'm going to walk you through a concept of data storytelling and an example of data storytelling with the following situation. So Dave develops reports on customer satisfaction for an eye care center. He updates that customer survey data once a week and shares that with his boss. Dave has then now been asked to provide a slide for a presentation on the call center's performance for a leadership presentation. Again, not too complicated of a situation here, but this is what Dave's been asked to do. And he's been asked to do it using this data. Now, where do you spot a potential important trend in this chart? So go to our background poll anywhere, you can just sort of point where you see a potential trend that we may want to share. If you're doing this on a phone, I'm sure it's super small. My apologies. I'm trying to find where that might be, some tiny, tiny data labels. We had a couple of votes saying, okay, around like week 8, week 7 to 9, there seems to be something happening here. Even further out at week 13, maybe there's something we want to call out. There's possibly multiple things that we want to point out in here. And the key to data storytelling is that we figure out what the most important element is for our stakeholders to either make a decision, to greenlight something to move forward, or to champion as a project for us to take on. So this is where we need to step back and think about our audience. So Rebecca's saying in the chart here, we've got a story about satisfied. Well, let's dig into that a little bit more, right? So something definitely seemed to be happening here with our dissatisfied in the first 8 weeks, right? We've got growing dissatisfaction with our customers. That's usually not a good sign. But then something seems to happen here along week 9 where our customer satisfaction is improving. We need to know more. We need to know what happened. And Dave has the context and background he needs to tell that story, but he needs to figure out how to do it in one slide and to a leadership audience. So what Dave needs is what I'm going to call the 5 Ds of data storytelling, which is a framework you can use to think about practically going through a process and considering your communication. Okay. Those 5 Ds are: define your key takeaway, draft a storyline, so think about the components and context and support that you need. These help you build your verbal message. Our final 3 Ds, display, declutter, and direct, help us think about how our visuals support our verbal, so we have a strong message both ways. We need to plan before we design, which is not always the order in which things go. Ming, I see you have a hand raised. If it's possible, if you can put your question in the Q&A or your thought in the Q&A, we can get to it. Or if you want to put it in the chat, that'll be easier. Thank you. So I'm going to go through these Ds for us here, right? Our first one is define. Define our key takeaway. And right, here's Dave looking very frustrated at this chart, trying to figure out what needs to be shared. And this is really where we need to do our thinking and planning around our communication. We need to think about our audience. Who are they? What's their leadership level? Are they internal or external? What do they care about given their role? We also need to think about the message, right? What is it exactly that we need people to remember and walk away with? And then what's our approach? Different people need to be communicated with in different ways, and we need to consider that. So I've gone ahead and done the hard work here about Dave's situation. Dave is presenting to leadership. It's an internal audience, and improving and maintaining customer satisfaction is the key KPI. The takeaway, right, that sticky message that Dave needs to share is that we implemented an AI chatbot. And since we did that, customer satisfaction has improved. There's our complication. There's that context that Dave knew that we didn't know looking at that data, even though we saw something change. Dave then also needs to think about the approach, right? And I want to talk here a little bit about data comfort and skepticism. And skepticism can be sort of how willing people might be or receptive they are to your idea. Data comfort, we could also just think about sort of their technical acuity. What do they know technically about what you're sharing? And knowing where they fall on this scale can help us sort of come up with an approach about how we want to communicate with our stakeholders. If we have, for example, over here, someone with high skepticism, but high data comfort or technical comfort, then we might just need to think about building up our argument with strong facts and perhaps more advanced visualizations so that we can sort of erode that skepticism, so we can prove our point. But on the other end, let's say we've got down here in our bottom left quadrant, someone who is not particularly knowledgeable about the subject or a technical background, but they also aren't particularly skeptical. This is where you're going to get straight to the point. You wouldn't use the same detail and structure and level of technical expertise as you would for the first person I just shared. Okay. So it's really important to think about where would your audience fall on this 2x2. And again, you can sort of change the axes as needed. There's a few different things that could be, but the idea is that you're really thinking about where does your audience land? And in this instance for Dave, I'm going to put his leadership sort of at high skepticism, medium to high data expertise. High skepticism because we're talking about AI, right? AI is all over the place. Some people really embrace it. Some people are very wary of it. We need to make sure that we're considering a high level of skepticism. And because they're in leadership, there's a certain level of data expertise that I think we can assume. So going back here, as we think about the approach, that's going to help us think about the details and the draft that we need to create. And then we need to think again about what is that specific data we need for the purpose. And in this case, we're trying to persuade. Now, you don't need to fill out a placemat like this. If you connect with me on LinkedIn later and you want this, I'm happy to share it with you. But the idea is that you're going through this process because this is what we don't often do. We don't think about our audience and the context and information they need. So you might use, just sort of an outline. That's if you've ever worked with a consultant from McKinsey, they use something similar to this, the SQR. The pyramid principle has us use a breakdown like this. It doesn't matter what you do, but what is important is that you think about your key takeaway and how you're going to lead your stakeholders to that key takeaway. That's defined. Now we're going to draft our storyline. And for drafting, this is where we have to make some strategic decisions, right? So here's Dave. He's got a whole bunch of background information and facts and figures that he might be able to put in to the report or to the slide. But he knows that he should probably ask some colleagues, and they're going to add to that list of things they know that may have impacted our customer satisfaction. And depending on the number of people he asks, there's even more that could be shared. This is where we need a plan, because if we share everything, if we don't cut down what we share, it becomes very difficult to communicate. And in the famous words of Michael Scott here, sometimes I'll start a sentence and I don't even know where it's going. I just hope I find it along the way, like an improv conversation, an improvisation. Now, I won't ask you to identify yourselves. If you've ever been a part of one of those improvisations, right, where someone is just talking and talking and talking and we never land the plane, we never get there, perhaps it's you. I've certainly done it before. But this is what happens when we don't plan. And when we don't have a plan, particularly when we're speaking about something technical, that's when people are going to tune out. They're not going to latch on to the important information or make the same connections that you might be making in your free-flowing thought process. Okay? So what that means for drafting is we need to sort of prioritize what we're going to include. We need to take that huge bucket of information that we have and distill it down to what's essential and make sure we keep those key points, and then what's not. And we don't necessarily get rid of what's not, but we don't lead with that, right? We maybe put it in an appendix or we have it ready if people have questions, but we don't distract with it. So that's what Dave's got to do, right? What actually needs to be included in terms of context and what doesn't. And this is where, again, going back to the story piece, this is where you want to make a connection. This is where you need to think about how you're going to connect those pieces of information to an action, a memory, something that your stakeholders can relate to. There's still a little more to draft. This is such an important idea. And when we're just talking about one slide, this may feel overkill, but if you're having a larger conversation, this draft is really where you're going to build a strong argument. Perhaps you've heard this quote before. Tell them what you're going to say it, and then tell them what you just said. Possibly you finished that on your own before I clicked it, right? We've heard that a bunch of times, maybe in different versions. This one's from Dale Carnegie, who wrote How to Make Friends and Influence People. But the idea here is that we can't just say something once. The first time someone hears a piece of information, they're processing it. They're not actually taking the time to make a connection or connect the dots that you might like them to. So while we say we need to repeat ourselves, it might feel redundant to us, but what we're doing is actually creating more opportunities for someone to form a sticky memory of what we're sharing. And I like to break this down to ensuring that when we have these technical conversations, we need to make sure that we are framing, explaining, and arriving for our audience. So just a quick overview of each here. When we frame, this is when we are going to make sure the main message is clear. Someone knows what they're walking into. There is no question about what is being shared. And it's where you can level with your audience and reflect on how you want them to feel. So get them ready for the conversation, put into context where this information falls in a larger goal or strategy, right? Really getting them prepared for what you need them to remember and listen to. Then explain. This is the meat and potatoes of your conversation or your presentation. This is where we're going to add clarity and certainty. So these are our facts, our figures, our support, and they could be data stories. They could be case studies. It could be frameworks, right? There's lots of ways to support an idea. This is where it falls into the explain. And how much you need to explain, again, depends on where your audience falls on that 2x2. And perhaps most importantly, you need to make sure you arrive, which means you've got actionable next steps. If you can't tell your stakeholder what to do next, you should have written an email, right? If there's no clear takeaway or key points that need to be reinforced, they're not going to remember or act on what you've said. So we need to really make sure, again, we're framing, explaining, and arriving to link what we recommend with our support to an action. So do that by drafting. Have Dave here take all of his points, perhaps frame this out in an outline. I like Post-its. There's no right or wrong way to do it. But again, the idea is that you're prioritizing and organizing so that your stakeholders better understand and can make meaning out of what you're sharing. All right, that's draft. So there's our verbal message, right? That was our planning part. Now we need to think about our display. So how does our visual help support our verbal? And I think we can all agree that this does not do a great job of explaining what's going on. And when I say visual, I don't just mean data visualization. Let's think about it as what you can see on one plane. So maybe that's a slide, a single screen, a website before the fold, right? First part of an email. Think about someone just looking at one piece or just one piece of paper, right? Organization matters there, and it's going to help people follow your story. Think about the newspaper. This one's from 1969, but our current newspapers with slightly nicer font and clarity there do the same thing. We have our title. Short, pithy, to the point, general idea of the article. Our subtitle is going to offer some more details, and we know if we really care about what happened, we've got to go into the text of that story. Now I'm picturing you all having a little chuckle at the screen right here because odds are this is how you read the screen. We're conditioned to follow a font hierarchy, even if it doesn't make sense in terms of where something is on the page. So what we take away from that is big and bold grabs our attention, which means the way that we organize that one slide, right, that one screen, whatever it is that someone's looking at, should follow the pyramid principle, which means our most important information should be at the top of that, again, two-dimensional plane that they're looking at. And as you skim down, you can get more and more into the details, right? Don't bury the lead. Get straight to the point right at the top. And this chart doesn't do it. It's a lost opportunity here by using what I call a stats 101 type, right? Telling you what data I'm looking at instead of why I should be thinking about it. One small change, adding a bit of a narrative here, saying right out front that our customer satisfaction has improved since our chatbot implementation, and it's become a permanent feature, saves some of the communication. That title tells me what I should have found in that very confusing chart. So often, a good title, a good, clear, clean key takeaway is going to help you out when you've got a bad visual. The reverse is seldom ever true. A great visualization doesn't necessarily help people get to the key takeaway if they don't have that concept and context beforehand. So, title, important, but that chart, thumbs down. I'd give it 2 thumbs down. I guess I can, even holding a clicker. So what I want to say is our chart selection should not be arbitrary. We can nerd out on this, some of you may already know this, but 40 years ago, 2 statisticians, William Cleveland and Robert McGill, were very interested in understanding how we quickly encode value to different elements of data visualizations. So what they found is we're least accurate when it comes to color or hue, right? And that makes sense because it's not like you see a red bar and you know it equals 10, right? There's no inherent value in color. And they, through their experiments, created the scale of accuracy all the way up to position on the common scale. What does this mean? Okay, well, I'm going to ask you here. Which green slice has the greatest value? Go ahead and just put it in the chat. D or E, which is the greatest value? Paul, going bold, out with D right away. Dana saying they look comparable. Chris and Yancy say E, we got some of the same. Oh, a lot of you thinking they're the same right now. Okay, it's tricky. And I feel pretty confident none of you would bet me $20 on your answer. Okay. Britta has come out and said pie charts are bad. And Britta, it's like you have an idea of what my next slice is, what my next slide is, where we take these slices and make them into a bar chart. And we can see in this instance, E has a slightly greater value, much more clearly than when it was in the pie chart. Okay. And that's easy to do when our bars are starting on a common base, but if we move them so they're no longer on an aligned base, it becomes much, much harder to quickly compare. And that's the situation we have here. Okay. So let's move it up the Cleveland-McGill scale. Let's put them on an aligned base. Yikes, that's maybe worse, right? So we could also do position on a common scale, and we have a line chart, which allows us to see the trends a bit more easily. Now, it's not a great line chart, and we'll get there, but in terms of the movement of our satisfaction levels, we can see that much more clearly. I'm going to thicken those bars up so that you can see them, and we're going to work with this display as we move into our final 2Ds. I'll pause here. Rebecca's got a good question in the Q&A here asking, when do you reinforce your point? Is it after every slide? Is it after several pages? The answer there is going to be, it depends, right? Because we share information of different magnitude, right? If we just have like a quick, hey, I need you to greenlight this new software because it's going to help us do X, Y, and Z faster, you probably don't need to build out anything very large around that, right? But if you've got something more complicated, if you're sort of breaking down the results of a QBR, quarter business lead review, and you want to talk about your next recommendations, well, you're probably going to need to section that off. And after each section, it's really good to go back and say, look, here was the key idea. Here's the data that supports it. Here's again what we need to do because this was the key idea. So it's going to feel repetitive to you, but for someone who's maybe just hearing the information for the first time, it's going to be helpful in their processing. So again, there's no perfect answer to that of how often you sort of go through and reiterate your key points, but you should probably do it a little more than feels comfortable, and your audience will thank you. All right, last 2Ds. Next, we're going to declutter, which means let's get anything and everything that's distracting out of our chart. And there's quite a few distracting elements there, right? What we're talking about is customer satisfaction. It's the line that I just highlighted, and it's hard to tell that that's the main event, okay? Part of that are these grid lines and data labels. Let's take those out, and already, like I feel like my heart is not beating nearly as fast taking a look at this. We're looking at trends over time, we're estimating. So we probably don't need every 10% on our y-axis. Maybe we can give a little breathing room, maybe go over 20% there, okay? And we can also think about decluttering our data series. So for example, right, what is the difference between very satisfied and satisfied? It's subjective, right? My very satisfied might be a pickier person's satisfied, right? There's not any real difference that we can equate to that. So another way that we can declutter is reducing our number of data series in this instance. Okay. Even when you do that, we're still eye tracking back and forth to figure out which legend label goes with the data series. So we can actually just make this even easier. We can take this legend and move it so that we've directly labeled our points. In this way, as you skim across and you see trends, right there, you've got the data series. But our key takeaway here is customer satisfaction. So why do we even introduce some dissatisfied or neutral into the conversation? Now, we shouldn't leave the data out because we don't want to share it, But what we want to do is make sure that we are focusing on the message. And if we include that information, it's possible that we get off track. So instead, maybe we just want to look at a single data series, and these are our satisfied or very satisfied customers. We declutter it, we get it down to its essential elements. So again, the focus is on our key message. And that's decluttering. And finally, we're going to direct attention. So one thing that we need to think about is when we highlight something, right? The idea is that it stands out. But if we highlight everything, then nothing's actually highlighted, right? We want to be really strategic with where we're directing attention, where we're putting special marks, and think about how they play into the story. So in this case, something that's going to really help my stakeholders is sort of saying, look, here's where we started the chatbot experiment, right? Point that out. They're not in your head. They don't know when it happened. Let's make that really clear. Direct attention to that point in time. And then if we're just skimming, right? If we add some data markers to key points, right? Where we started, our low point, where we are now, it's going to draw your attention there. Know that those are sort of more important points in time in terms of the story than the rest of the data points. And then we can just label those so we don't have to go ahead and estimate. We can be precise with those key moments in time so that we're able to, again, quickly skim and get an idea of what's happening. And this was subtle here, right? We've been talking about customer satisfaction being improved, the chatbot should stay. Another way we can direct attention is with our words. So in this case, perhaps chatbot support has supercharged customer satisfaction, and it should become a permanent feature. Now, be careful with language. Different organizations, right? Different disciplines. You need sometimes some very certain and exact language. We don't want to be subjective here. But when we use words that maybe we're not used to hearing on a daily basis, particularly around our work, that's also going to help make our message sticky. So something to consider there as well. What's your wording? It's possible we could make it easy for our audience to say, oh, customer satisfaction is green. I'm going to actually make a connection here that when I see green, that's customer service data, customer satisfaction data. And that's true. We use, it's called the Gestalt law of similarity. They have similar characteristics, so we innately think they belong together or connected. So those are the 5 Ds that can really help consider what you're communicating, who you're communicating it to, and why it's important, and then build your visual and verbal support for that. So we could just go back. Here's where we started. Here's an option for where we end after our 5 Ds. I want to leave time for some question and answer. Again, it's just an intro to this idea of communicating really clearly with data. So I'm sure there are questions and I'll try to answer as many as I can, but I do want to just put out here that a picture, or in this case, a data visualization, can be worth 1,000 words. And sometimes it's worth fully being in control of that to control the narrative and the storyline. So when we look at this whole slide that we put together, we need to think about where we need to add perhaps some color, some extra commentary. And when you put the whole slide up there, even though this is pretty decluttered, pretty minimalistic, it's still possible that the narrative you're adding is lost. So particularly with time series data, sometimes a fun thing to do is walk your audience through it. It could look like this. All right, we started off the year in a free fall. We had our customer satisfaction levels decrease by half within the first 8 weeks of the year. We knew we had to do something. And our answer, after many options are out there, was let's try a chatbot. And can that chatbot reverse this free falling trend? Well, it did great. Right out of the gate, we saw over a 45% increase of customers saying they're satisfied with their service. And that wasn't just a fluke. It was sustained over the entire 12-week experiment. So we should definitely keep this chatbot because even though it didn't have that explosive growth when it first was introduced, we can see here that our customer satisfaction level is still much higher than where we started before the experiment. So again, can walk your audience through it. It's called a stage chart. But that's a way, again, that you can sort of control the narrative. And I like to say control the narrative, not because you're trying to be deceptive, but because sometimes we can distract unintentionally. If you have 45 minutes with a person, you probably don't want to talk at them for 45 minutes. Maybe your key information can be given in 5 minutes and you have a discussion for 40 minutes and really get to the root of the problem, making all of your communication and time with a stakeholder more valuable. Okay. So again, we need to remember that data or technical understanding, right? We need to translate that. It's a different language for some people, and we need to really consider where they might fall in the scale compared to where we are, and how do we make sure we're talking to them so that they can be part of the conversation, right? By breaking things down, by not using technical language or acronyms, right? These are all really important. So when we translate, provide context, that's what's going to help us drive action. So thanks, everyone. I think we've got a few minutes for Q&A. So if you want to add it into the general Q&A that's there, please feel free. Or I think I can unmute you. If you want to be unmuted, you can just, I think, raise your hand and I'm able to unmute you. So feel free to take any questions now. If you don't have any, that's also totally fine. But again, feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn if you want any of the tools that I shared, or just want to talk more about communication.
Thank you. It was very straightforward. Actually, it is very easy to understand. That's why we don't have questions.
Well, a question that I often get, not to put questions in anyone's mouth here, is, that's great. Those are really simple examples. That's not what my information looks like. And I completely understand, right? We had about 40 minutes together. We don't want to go into some crazy data set. I know that you're probably dealing with big data, things that are far more complicated than this, but the principles are the same, right? Stepping back and thinking about, okay, where is your audience? What's most essential? And how do I communicate that clearly? And you can do that with large data sets and small data sets, as long as you're doing the planning and thinking about them, and giving time for that.
Like a combining data science with design thinking.
Yeah, exactly.
That's great. Yeah, I'm just seeing the chat, and people like it. They could feedback. Great. Thank you for your time. I appreciate it. And yeah, thank you everyone for joining as well. And yeah, I'm pretty interested in what you're doing now. I looked at it while you're also teaching. I'd like to reach out to see some partnership opportunities there as well. So, thank you, everyone. So I hope you have a good rest of the day for the people in US and rest of the night for the people abroad. So.
Thanks, everyone, for joining. Again, feel free to connect with LinkedIn or send me an email, and take care.
Thank you.